While it's great to have confidence and a strong sense of self-worth, it can sometimes lead to reckless decisions. This was the case for a woman weighing over 300 pounds. Upon hearing her weight, most would assume she couldn't move quickly, yet she proved otherwise. In a dangerous turn of events, she attempted to outrun a grizzly bear during a confrontation. What happened next is recounted in this video. Irina Ivanova had always believed herself invincible, a woman capable of bending reality to her will. Her carefully curated online presence painted her as a fearless adventurer, even though most of her exploits were staged. Signing up for the Altai Wilderness hiking tour was a deliberate move to bolster that image, a way to showcase her indomitable spirit in one of Russia's most forbidding landscapes. But the wild cared nothing for her ambitions, and it would prove to be a far more brutal adversary than she anticipated. The first few days of the hike were uneventful, though challenging for Irina. She struggled to match the pace of the group and ignored the guide's patient warnings about respecting the wilderness. Her focus remained on capturing the perfect shots. Jagged peaks shrouded in mist, glacial streams cutting through ancient forests, and her silhouette posed against endless horizons. The guides, seasoned and wary, watched her antics with silent disapproval. By the fourth day, the group approached a secluded trail near a river teeming with salmon. The air buzzed with the earthy tang of damp moss and the rhythmic rush of water. The guides, alert as ever, instructed everyone to stay vigilant. The region was known to attract Russian grizzlies, drawn by the abundance of salmon. While rare, encounters could be lethal if handled poorly. Irina, brushing off their cautions, rolled her eyes and lingered at the rear, focused on perfecting her latest post. As they wound more profoundly into the forest, the atmosphere grew oppressive. Shadows stretched long, and the calls of distant birds fell eerily silent. Suddenly, a guide froze, his hand raised in a signal to halt. Ahead, a massive grizzly bear emerged from the undergrowth. The creature was awe-inspiring in its sheer power, standing nearly 3 meters tall on its hind legs and weighing over 300 kilograms. Its coarse fur glistened with moisture, and its black eyes locked onto the group, assessing them with unnerving intelligence. The group obeyed the guide's whispered instructions, standing frozen and avoiding eye contact. Irina, however, felt panic flood her senses. Her confidence evaporated as the bear lowered itself to all fours, its heavy muscles rippling with every step. In a split-second decision driven by instinct rather than reason, she bolted. The sudden movement broke the delicate tension of the moment. The bear, startled and now perceiving Irina as prey, charged. The grizzly's speed was astonishing. For a creature of its size, it moved with terrifying swiftness, its paws pounding the ground in a relentless rhythm. Irina's flight was clumsy and desperate. Her heavier frame and lack of familiarity with the terrain worked against her. She stumbled over exposed roots and struggled to gain traction on the uneven forest floor. Her breath came in ragged gasps as adrenaline surged through her veins. Behind her, the bear closed the distance effortlessly, its powerful strides fueled by primal instinct. Each heavy footfall seemed to shake the earth, a relentless reminder of her impending doom. She cast a panicked glance over her shoulder, and the sight of the beast barreling toward her broke what little composure she had left. The uneven ground claimed her. Her foot snagged on a protruding root, sending her sprawling forward. She landed hard, her palms scraping against rough dirt and jagged rocks. Before she could scramble back to her feet, the grizzly was upon her. The force of its arrival was devastating, its massive body crushing the underbrush as it swiped at her with a paw the size of a dinner plate. The blow was not just powerful, it was catastrophic. Sharp claws tore through her jacket and into her back, sending a spray of blood across the forest floor. Irina screamed a raw, primal sound that echoed through the stillness. The bear reared back momentarily before clamping its jaws around her shoulder, the pressure fracturing bone and shredding muscle. Her struggles were frantic, but futile. She thrashed against the beast's unyielding grip, her hands clawing at the dirt and leaves as if she could somehow drag herself away. But the bear's strength was impossible. In its ferocity, the bear shook her violently, tearing flesh and sinew with horrifying ease. Blood soaked the ground, a dark crimson pool spreading beneath her. Her cries weakened, fading into ragged gasps as shock overtook her. The world around her blurred, her vision narrowing to pinpoints as her body began to shut down. Pain, once all-encompassing, dulled to a distant ache as her strength ebbed away. It was over in less than 3 minutes. The bear, sensing no further resistance, ceased its attack. Irina's lifeless body lay crumpled and broken, her once vivid aura extinguished in the merciless wilderness. The grizzly lingered briefly, sniffing the air before lumbering away, uninterested in the remains. The forest resumed its eerie stillness, as if the violent episode had been merely a ripple in the vast, uncaring expanse of nature. When the group cautiously approached the site, led by the pale-faced guides, they found Irina's remains amid the trampled foliage. The scene was devastating, a grim testament to the power of the wilderness and the folly of underestimating it. The guides, hardened by years of experience, silently worked to collect what they could. The group stood in stunned silence, the weight of mortality settling heavily on their shoulders. The aftermath was haunting. As the group made their way back to civilization, the once light-hearted trek transformed into a somber retreat. Irina's fate became a cautionary tale among the guides and the region's residents, a stark reminder of the wilderness's unforgiving nature. Jake had always dreamed of an escape into the wilderness, a chance to prove his independence and reconnect with nature in its purest form. At 24, he felt ready for his first solo camping trip, imagining peaceful nights under the stars and a brief reprieve from the demands of city life. The Adirondacks, with their sprawling forests, glacial lakes, and untamed beauty, seemed like the perfect destination. At the ranger station, he received a standard briefing on wilderness safety. The ranger stressed the importance of storing food away from the campsite, preferably in a bear canister or suspended high in a tree. Jake listened politely but dismissed the warnings as overly cautious. Black bears, he reasoned, were timid creatures. They avoided humans and indeed wouldn't venture near his tent. Confident in his judgment, he packed his supplies and headed deep into the forest. The day unfolded as he had hoped. He hiked along secluded trails, marveled at the vibrant hues of autumn leaves, and basked in the serenity of his surroundings. By late afternoon, he found a clearing near a calm lake and pitched his tent. The spot felt idyllic, a postcard-perfect scene of wilderness solitude. After dinner, he left the remnants of his meal inside his tent, convinced that no harm would come from bending the rules just this once. With the sun setting and the forest cloaked in shadow, he crawled into his sleeping bag, exhaustion quickly pulling him into sleep. Hours later, Jake was jolted awake by a faint rustling outside. His initial thought was that it must be the wind or a small animal. He lay still, straining to listen. The noise grew louder and more deliberate, a low snuffling and the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps padding over fallen leaves. His pulse quickened as the realization hit. A bear. The noise grew closer until it was right outside the thin fabric of his tent. Jake's breath hitched as the bear sniffed and pawed at the canvas, drawn by the scent of the food inside. Before he could formulate a plan, the bear's claws tore through the fabric, slicing it open in one swift motion. The tent collapsed around Jake as the animal pushed its way inside, its hulking form blotting out the faint moonlight. Panic surged through him, primal and overwhelming. Instinct took over. Jake thrashed wildly, kicking and flailing in a desperate attempt to fend off the intruder. His movements, however, only served to provoke the bear further. The animal let out a guttural growl and lashed out, its mighty paw striking Jake across his torso. The blow was like being hit with a sledgehammer, the claws raking through his jacket and skin. Pain exploded through his chest, but adrenaline dulled the worst of it, propelling him into action. In a frantic bid for survival, Jake grabbed his flashlight and switched it on, shining the beam directly into the bear's eyes. The sudden brightness startled the animal, causing it to hesitate. Seizing the opportunity, Jake scrambled out of the ruined tent and stumbled into the forest. The darkness was disorienting, the trees looming like shadowy sentinels. He ran unthinkingly, his breaths ragged and his injured side throbbing with each step. The bear, momentarily confused, soon regained its focus and gave chase. Jake could hear its heavy footfalls behind him, the snapping of branches as it barreled through the undergrowth. Desperation drove him forward until he spotted a tree with low-hanging branches. With no other options, he clawed his way up, his bloodied hands slipping on the bark. Pain shot through his ribs with every movement, but he forced himself higher until he was out of the bear's reach. From his perch, Jake could see the bear circling below, its dark shape barely visible against the forest floor. It huffed and growled, pawing at the base of the tree as if testing his resolve. He clung to the branch, trembling, every muscle in his body screaming for relief. Time became meaningless as he waited, his mind consumed by fear and the gnawing realization of how badly he had misjudged the dangers of the wilderness. Hours dragged by, the cold seeping into his bones. The bear eventually wandered off, but Jake dared not descend, fearing it might still be nearby. Blood soaked his shirt, and his breathing grew shallow and labored. He was losing strength, the pain in his chest and hands becoming impossible to ignore. As the first light of dawn broke through the canopy, he began to feel the effects of shock setting in, his vision swimming and his thoughts growing hazy. The distant sound of voices snapped him back to reality. A rescue team, alerted by his failure to check in at the ranger station, had been dispatched to search for him. They spotted him high in the tree, his pale face and torn clothing a stark contrast to the vibrant autumn leaves. With great care, they coaxed him down, their expressions grim as they assessed his injuries. Jake was rushed to the nearest hospital, the journey a blur of flashing lights and muffled voices. His injuries were severe but not life-threatening. Deep lacerations across his torso, fractured ribs, and multiple abrasions on his hands and legs. The medical team worked quickly to stabilize him, and their efficiency was a sharp contrast to the chaos he had endured in the forest. In the days that followed, Jake's story spread, becoming a cautionary tale about the dangers of neglecting basic safety practices in bear country. He recounted his ordeal with a mix of shame and humility, acknowledging the arrogance that had led him to ignore the ranger's warnings. The wilderness, he realized, was not something to be taken lightly. It was vast, untamed, and utterly indifferent to human ambition or carelessness. Kayla Lewis, 28, was an adventurer of the digital age, where risks were carefully calibrated to maximize engagement. Her Instagram feed was a kaleidoscope of curated perfection: sunsets over cliffs, carefully balanced yoga poses in exotic locales, and now the rugged beauty of Alaska's wilderness. But despite her polished online persona, Kayla was still a rookie. She had yet to venture beyond the borders of America, and her experiences were limited to domestic landscapes she could reach with her trusty backpack and a meticulous itinerary. Determined to prove herself as more than a casual wanderer, Kayla had made it her mission to visit every national park in the United States and, hopefully, out of the country. The ambitious goal fueled her wanderlust and her feed, a blend of awe and aspiration that kept her followers hooked. One popular Alaska park was her latest conquest, the raw and untamed wilderness, promising not only breathtaking content, but also a challenge that would test her limits. On her fourth day hiking through the park, Kayla spotted her opportunity: a grizzly bear feeding on a moose carcass near a creek just off the trail. It was enormous, its dense fur rippling over powerful muscles. claws flashing as it tore into its meal. The scene was raw and primal, the kind of moment that would electrify her followers. Without hesitation, she grabbed her phone and began a live stream. Her pulse quickened as she narrated in hushed excitement, her voice tinged with a blend of fear and exhilaration. The bear had not yet noticed her. It was focused on its feast, but every muscle in its body radiated tension, a reminder of its wildness and unpredictability. Kayla, undeterred, crept closer. Warnings from her friends earlier that day echoed faintly in her mind, but they were drowned out by the thrill of the moment. Her viewership spiked as notifications rolled in. Thousands of people were now watching. Seeing the vast amount of viewers, she took a few cautious steps closer, keeping her camera trained on the bear. She was narrating every move, hyper-aware of her audience and their comments flooding the screen. She felt as though the invisible barrier of the screen buffered the distance between her and the apex predator. But nature had no respect for digital boundaries. The bear raised its head abruptly. Its small, dark eyes locked onto her, unblinking and intense. A guttural growl rumbled from its chest, low and menacing. Kayla froze, her smile faltering for a moment. But she quickly reassured herself, speaking to her audience, that she wasn't in real danger. The bear, however, saw no camera, no followers, no context. All it recognized was a threat encroaching on its territory and meal. The massive predator rose to its full height, towering over the scene like a nightmare come to life. Kayla's chest tightened as the reality of her situation clawed its way through her bravado. Still, she hesitated to retreat, more afraid of the ridicule from her viewers than the danger before her. Her phone shook in her hand, capturing the hulking beast as it dropped to all fours and began a slow, deliberate advance. A flood of adrenaline surged through Kayla as the bear's intent became clear. It was charging. She spun and ran, the phone slipping from her grasp and landing with its camera still streaming. Her followers watched in horror as the scene spiraled into chaos. The sound of her breath, ragged and desperate, mixed with the bear's thunderous growls and the crashing of underbrush. Kayla's legs burned as she sprinted, but the uneven terrain worked against her. The forest floor was a tangle of roots and moss-covered rocks, each step a gamble. Her hiking boots slipped on damp earth, and she nearly toppled twice before regaining her footing. Behind her, the bear closed the distance with terrifying speed, its powerful limbs propelling it forward like a locomotive. Panic gripped her mind, clouding any semblance of strategy. She fumbled with the straps of her backpack, her fingers trembling as she searched for the canister of bear spray she'd packed. The bear was close now, too close. She could feel the ground shudder beneath its charge and hear the snapping of branches as it tore through the forest in pursuit. In a final, desperate act, Kayla turned and unleashed a stream of the bright orange spray. The chemical cloud hit the bear squarely in the face. It stopped abruptly, shaking its massive head and pawing at its muzzle. The spray burned, irritating its eyes and nostrils, forcing the animal into retreat. It growled again, a sound of frustration and warning, before retreating into the undergrowth, its massive form disappearing like a shadow into the forest. Kayla collapsed onto her knees, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her heart hammered in her chest, and her lungs struggled to draw air. She was alive, but the ordeal had left its mark. Blood oozed from deep scratches along her arm, the result of a branch she'd collided with her frantic escape. Her palms were raw from her fall, her knees scraped and bruised. But she survived. 30 minutes later, park rangers arrived, guided by the live stream they had been alerted to by concerned viewers. The phone, still recording, lay on the ground, capturing their arrival. They found Kayla seated against a tree, her face pale and streaked with tears. The bear spray canister was clenched tightly in her hands, her lifeline in the harrowing encounter. The rangers administered first aid, noting her injuries were superficial compared to what could have been. They escorted her back to the trailhead, A mix of relief and exasperation etched into their faces. In their line of work, they had seen the consequences of human recklessness in the wilderness. However, this was a stark reminder of how social media had added a dangerous new dimension to such behavior. By the time Kayla reached the hospital for further evaluation, the footage of her encounter had gone viral. News outlets picked up the story, dissecting every second of the live stream. Debates erupted online about the ethics of her actions. Some condemned her recklessness, accusing her of endangering herself and the bear for the sake of clicks. Others admire her courage, albeit misguided, and celebrate her survival as a testament to quick thinking and preparation. Kayla, watching the coverage from her hospital bed, felt a mix of shame and relief. The adrenaline of the moment had faded, replaced by a profound sense of vulnerability. The forest, she realized, was not a backdrop for her ambitions. It was a living, breathing force that demanded respect. The incident became a flashpoint for discussions on the intersection of technology and wilderness. Experts weighed in, highlighting the importance of education and the dangers of approaching wild animals. The park implemented stricter guidelines, while Kayla herself became an unlikely advocate for responsible behavior in nature. The scars on her body would heal, but the experience left an indelible mark on her spirit. For Kayla, the wilderness was no longer a playground for content creation, but a sobering reminder of humanity's place within it. Small, fragile, and accountable. The Thompson family had looked forward to this trip for months. Their pick was a popular park in Montana with its sprawling meadows, towering peaks, and dense forests. It promised a break from the bustle of city life. Brian and his wife, Rachel, hoped the experience would teach their children, 9-year-old Emily and 7-year-old Liam, an appreciation for the natural world. The campsite they chose was picturesque, surrounded by tall pines and not far from a crystal-clear stream. For 2 days, they reveled in the tranquility, hiking trails, spotting wildlife from a safe distance, and roasting marshmallows under the vast, star-speckled sky. On the third morning, before dawn had fully broken, the chill of the wilderness still hung heavy in the air. The campsite was silent except for the faint rustle of wind through the trees. The family slept soundly in their tent, the previous day's hike leaving them blissfully exhausted. Outside their campsite, like so many others, was marked by the remnants of human activity. A cooler, a few trash bags tied securely to a tree, and the faint smell of grilled food lingering in the air. Unbeknownst to the family, these seemingly harmless traces had caught the attention of a hungry bear. The animal, a hefty black bear weighing nearly 300 pounds, had been roaming the area for days, driven by the insatiable need to fatten up before winter. It sniffed the air, its keen nose detecting the promise of an easy meal. Guided by instinct and hunger, it lumbered toward the campsite. Brian stirred first, waking to a low scraping sound. It was still dim outside, but he could make out the faint silhouette of something significant near the cooler. His pulse quickened as the realization struck him. A bear was in their camp. He nudged Rachel awake, gesturing silently toward the shadowy figure. Fear gripped them both as they peered through the tent flap. The bear had overturned the cooler, pawing through its contents with casual destruction. For a moment they stayed frozen, hoping the bear would take what it wanted and leave. But their hopes were dashed when Emily let out a soft, sleepy murmur, the sound drawing the bear's attention. Its head snapped up, eyes glinting in the half-light, and it began to move closer to the tent. Rachel clutched the children, whispering soothing reassurances as they huddled together. Brian knew they couldn't remain passive. The bear, encouraged by the scent of food and the proximity of easy prey, started clawing at the tent's fabric. Its immense power became terrifyingly clear as the thin nylon began to give way. Brian made a split-second decision. He grabbed the only thing resembling a weapon, a sturdy walking stick he had used during their hikes, and stepped out of the tent. His heart pounded as he waved the stick in the air, making himself appear larger. The bear paused, startled by his sudden appearance, and let out a low, guttural growl. Brian felt its eyes bore into him, a mixture of curiosity and threat. He took a cautious step forward, yelling and swinging the stick, hoping to drive it away. For a moment it worked. The bear hesitated, backing off slightly, but its hunger overrode its wariness. It lunged toward Brian, closing the distance with shocking speed. Brian barely had time to react before the bear's massive paw swiped at him, the blow knocking him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, pain radiating through his chest as the stick fell from his grasp. The bear was on him in an instant, its weight crushing. It roared, the sound primal and loud, as it bit down on Brian's forearm. The pain was searing, a white-hot flash that left him gasping. He thrashed beneath the bear, his free hand clawing at its face in a desperate attempt to fend it off. The bear responded with another swipe, its claws raking across his torso. Blood soaked his shirt, the wounds deep and jagged. From inside the tent, Rachel clutched the children tightly, shielding their eyes from the horror unfolding outside. She whispered frantic prayers, her fear giving way to helplessness as she listened to Brian's struggles and the bear's ferocious growls. The children whimpered, their tiny bodies trembling as they tried to comprehend the chaos around them. Brian fought with everything he had, his body writhing under the relentless assault. The bear bit down again, this time on his thigh, its jaws clamping with bone-crushing force. His screams pierced the air, a sound of raw agony and defiance. Despite the excruciating pain, he kicked at the bear's underbelly with his uninjured leg, the blows weak but persistent. He knew he had to buy time, for his family, for the chance that help might come. Unbeknownst to the Thompsons, the commotion had drawn the attention of nearby campers. One of them, recognizing the danger, ran to alert the park rangers. The minutes dragged on like hours, Brian's strength waning as the bear's attacks grew more frenzied. He felt his vision blur, the edges darkening as blood loss and exhaustion took their toll. The ranger's arrival was marked by the sharp crack of a warning shot. The bear froze, its instincts overriding its aggression as it processed the unfamiliar threat. With a final snarl, it released Brian and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. The aftermath was harrowing. Brian lay motionless on the ground, his body battered and bloodied, his breathing shallow. The rangers worked quickly, administering first aid while calling for a medevac. Rachel emerged from the tent, tears streaming down her face as she cradled her children, their cries muffled against her chest. Brian survived, but his injuries were severe. He endured multiple surgeries to repair the damage to his arm and leg, followed by months of painful rehabilitation. The scars, both physical and emotional, were permanent reminders of that fateful morning. Yet through it all, he remained steadfast in his belief that he had done what any parent would do. His sacrifice had ensured the safety of his family, a testament to the depths of a father's love. The incident became a cautionary tale, spreading through news outlets and sparking conversations about the risks of wilderness camping. Experts emphasized the importance of proper food storage, bear-proof containers, and understanding animal behavior. For the Thompsons, the lesson was deeply personal, a stark reminder of nature's unpredictability and power. Though their idyllic trip ended in tragedy, it forged an unbreakable bond within the family. Brian's courage and resilience became a source of inspiration, not only for his children, but for all who heard his story. A reminder that even in the face of nature's fury, the strength of the human spirit could endure. Bridger Teton National Forest was a sacred sanctuary where towering pines and meandering trails offered both challenge and escape. Running had been his solace for years, a way to process the chaos of life, and the wildness of Wyoming only deepened his connection to the sport. He rarely encountered anyone on the trails, and that isolation was part of the allure. The morning air was crisp, laced with the earthy scent of damp pine needles and moss. Marco's breath formed soft clouds as his feet rhythmically pounded the dirt trail, his focus locked on the twisting path ahead. He carried only the essentials: a small backpack containing water, a first aid kit, and a few energy bars. The bear spray had never been part of his gear. He had read about bear encounters, but they seemed like distant, almost mythic events. It was Wyoming, after all. Bears were part of the landscape, but he had never seen one. The trail wound deeper into the forest, where the trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that muted the morning light. Marco relished the challenge of navigating the narrow, uneven path, his stride adjusting instinctively to avoid roots and rocks. He had no way of knowing that his path would soon intersect with one of nature's most fearsome creatures. As Marco rounded a bend, his eyes caught movement ahead. A massive grizzly bear stood just off the trail, her two cubs tumbling playfully in the underbrush. Marco's heart stopped. He froze mid-stride, his mind racing. The bear turned her head, her dark eyes locking onto him. Instinctively, Marco knew he had crossed an invisible line. The mother bear rose onto her hind legs, her massive frame towering above the cubs. She let out a low, guttural huff, a warning that sent a surge of adrenaline through Marco's veins. The cubs, startled by their mother's reaction, scrambled behind her. Marco's chest tightened as he tried to process what to do. His stillness only lasted a second before instinct betrayed him. He bolted. The mother bear exploded into motion, her massive body moving with terrifying speed. Marco's feet pounded the ground as he sprinted down the trail, his lungs burning with effort. The world became a blur of green and brown as he pushed himself to his limits. The bear's heavy footfalls thundered behind him, impossibly close. She was closing the distance, her primal determination fueled by the perceived threat to her cubs. Marco's mind raced. He had heard that running from a bear was futile, but his body rebelled against logic. Driven by fear, he zigzagged off the trail and into the dense forest, hoping the erratic movement would confuse her. Branches tore at his clothes and face, and the uneven ground threatened to trip him at every step. But the bear was relentless. Her massive form crashed through the undergrowth, undeterred by the obstacles that slowed Marco. He stumbled and regained his footing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His legs screamed for relief, but the instinct to survive pushed him forward. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of trees and shadows with no escape in sight. He could feel the bear's presence, a crushing inevitability bearing down on him with every stride. Suddenly, Marco's foot caught on a gnarled root hidden beneath a layer of leaves. He fell hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him. Dazed, he scrambled to his knees, his eyes darting around for a way out. The bear was upon him now, her massive frame emerging from the foliage like a force of nature. Her jaws gaped, revealing teeth that could crush bone, and her dark eyes burned with protective fury. As she charged, Marco's backpack, dislodged during his fall, lay in her path. The bear skidded to a halt, her massive paws digging into the dirt as she focused on the unfamiliar object. For a moment, Marco was forgotten. The bear sniffed the backpack, her powerful nose analyzing the strange mix of synthetic material and human scent. Marco seized the opportunity, his survival instincts kicking into overdrive. His eyes locked onto a nearby tree, its lower branches just within reach. Fueled by desperation, he scrambled to his feet and lunged for the trunk. His hands found purchase on the rough bark, and he pulled himself up, his muscles straining with effort. The bear finished inspecting the backpack and turned her attention back to Marco. She reared onto her hind legs, her massive claws swiping at the trunk as he climbed higher. Marco clung to the tree, his body trembling with exertion and fear. The bear roared, her powerful voice reverberating through the forest. She tried to climb, her claws gouging deep into the bark, but her massive weight worked against her. Frustrated, she circled the base of the tree, her eyes never leaving Marco. He pressed himself against the trunk, his heart pounding so loudly he thought it might burst. Minutes felt like hours as the standoff continued. The bear eventually grew bored, her maternal instincts pulling her back to her cubs. She let out one final huff before lumbering back into the forest, her cubs trailing behind her. Marco remained frozen in the tree, too shaken to move. When the forest's silence returned, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves, Marco allowed himself to breathe. His hands were raw from gripping the bark, and his arms and legs trembled from the strain. Slowly he climbed down, his feet unsteady on the ground. He retrieved his shredded backpack, now marked with claw slashes, and began the long walk back to the trailhead. By the time rangers found him later that morning, Marco was pale and visibly shaken but unharmed. They listened intently as he recounted his ordeal, their expressions shifting between concern and subtle frustration at his lack of preparation. It was clear to them that Marco had been fortunate. In the weeks that followed, Marco's perspective on the wilderness changed profoundly. His near-death experience became a driving force behind his advocacy for bear safety awareness. He shared his story with fellow runners and outdoor enthusiasts, emphasizing the importance of carrying bear spray and respecting wildlife's boundaries. Though Marco eventually returned to the trails, he did so with a newfound respect for the power of nature. The snowstorm howled around Diane Roberts' cabin with a fury that seemed to rattle the very bones of the structure. The retired teacher, a sturdy woman of 64, had settled into the remote Alaskan wilderness for a month of solitude and reflection, her only companions the crackling fire and a few well-loved books. The storm had been raging for 2 days, its relentless gusts piling snow against the walls and sealing her off from the world. Yet she felt secure in her small, modestly equipped cabin. She had grown accustomed to the eerie silence that came with isolation. The wind was a companion now, a constant presence in the background. But that night, something felt off. As she sat in the glow of the fire, a strange unease crept over her, a sensation she couldn't quite place. The usual sounds of the storm were interrupted by a heavy thud against the cabin's outer wall. Her pulse quickened. She waited, straining to hear over the roar of the wind. Another thud came louder this time, followed by a low, guttural growl that froze her blood. Diane stood slowly, her senses sharp with adrenaline. There had been stories of hungry predators venturing closer to human dwellings during harsh winters, and she had taken precautions, storing her food in sturdy containers and keeping no scraps outside. Yet hunger made wild animals bold, and the thin walls of her cabin were no match for desperation. The thuds became more insistent, and then the sound of claws raking wood filled the room. Diane's heart pounded. She grabbed the flashlight and swept its beam toward the window. For a moment, she saw nothing but the swirling white chaos of the storm. Then, the massive silhouette appeared. A bear, gaunt and wild-eyed, its fur matted with ice, was clawing at the side of her cabin, sniffing the air with frantic intensity. Her mind raced as she considered her options. There was no phone signal, and the storm had long since made the trails impassable. She was utterly alone. The bear struck again, and this time the flimsy wooden wall groaned under the impact. Diane ran to the pantry, the sturdiest room in the cabin, grabbing the flare gun and a hunting knife she had brought for emergencies. She barely managed to drag a heavy chest of supplies against the pantry door before the wall gave way with a loud crash. The bear was inside. The creature's growls reverberated through the cabin, a terrifying sound that spoke of primal hunger. Diane crouched in the darkness of the pantry, clutching the flare gun in one hand and the knife in the other. She could hear the bear's heavy breathing and the scrape of its claws as it tore through her belongings. Pots clanged, furniture splintered, and the air filled with the stench of musk and damp fur. For hours, the bear rampaged through the cabin, its frustration growing as it failed to find sustenance. Diane remained motionless, every muscle in her body taut with fear. Her mind oscillated between hopelessness and determination. She knew she could not afford to give in to panic. Survival was the only option. Eventually, the bear turned its attention to the pantry. The first blow against the door was seismic, shaking the chest that Diane had wedged against it. She braced herself, her mind racing through everything she knew about bear behavior. The animal's persistence was terrifying. Its hunger made it relentless. Each impact splintered the door further, and the bear's growls deepened with every failed attempt to breach her sanctuary. When the door finally gave way, Diane sprang into action. The bear lunged, its massive form barely squeezing through the shattered frame. She fired the flare gun, and the confined space was immediately flooded with blinding light and acrid smoke. The bear recoiled, a pained roar filling the small room as the flare struck its shoulder, igniting its fur. The smell of burning hair and flesh was nauseating, but Diane couldn't hesitate. The bear thrashed wildly, its claws slashing at the air. Diane used the distraction to jab at its face with the knife, aiming for its sensitive nose. The blade connected, and the bear let out a guttural scream, rearing back in a frenzy. Its swipes were erratic but devastating, and one caught her across the arm, tearing through her coat and skin with sickening ease. Blood spattered against the pantry walls, and Diane bit back a cry of pain as she staggered backward. The bear lunged again, its massive jaws snapping inches from her face. She fired another flare, this time aiming directly into its gaping maw. The resulting explosion of light and heat sent the creature into a panicked retreat. It stumbled out of the pantry, colliding with walls and furniture as it scrambled to escape the cabin. Diane could hear it crashing through the broken fence and back into the storm, its roars fading into the distance. The silence that followed was overwhelming. Diane sank to the floor, her hands trembling as she pressed a towel against the deep gashes on her arm. Blood seeped through the fabric, warm and sticky, but she forced herself to remain calm. She knew she couldn't afford to lose too much blood or let the wounds become infected. She spent the following hours in a haze of pain and exhaustion, fashioning crude bandages from strips of cloth and using snow to clean her wounds. The storm raged on outside, the broken wall allowing icy air to flood the cabin. Diane shivered uncontrollably, her body weak but her mind resolute. She piled on layers of clothing and huddled near the remnants of the fire, feeding it with whatever wood she could salvage. Days passed in a blur of cold and hunger. Diane rationed her remaining food, melting snow for water and keeping the fire alive with sheer will. The wounds on her arm throbbed with every movement, but she focused on survival, refusing to let despair take hold. The storm finally subsided, leaving a crystalline silence in its wake. It was on the fourth day that salvation arrived. A group of snowmobilers, alerted by a faint trail of smoke from her chimney, discovered the cabin. They found Diane pale and weak but alive, her arm crudely bandaged and her spirit unbroken. She recounted her ordeal as they transported her to the nearest town, her voice steady, despite the horrors she had endured. Diane's story quickly spread, becoming a testament to human resilience and ingenuity. The cabin, now a ruin, stood as a stark reminder of the unforgiving wilderness and the fragile line between survival and death. For Diane, the experience was transformative. She had faced nature's raw power and lived to tell the tale, a survivor in every sense of the word.